Hello, my name is Mark Milstein, and I'm Director of the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. And I want to welcome you to the 6th Annual Cornell Business Impact Symposium. Today is the first of 6 panels that will take place over the next 10 days. This symposium will culminate on April 17th with the finals of the first Cornell Impact Investing Competition, which I hope you'll join us for. CBIS is only possible because of the hard work of a lot of people who deserve recognition. First, I want to thank the students from the 7 graduate and undergraduate clubs that collaborate with the center each year to make CBIS a reality. I also want to thank my center colleagues Monica Tunar and Sophia Abdulhamid for all their efforts that make this possible. Additionally, we want to thank eCornell for enabling us to hold this event virtually for the 2nd year in a row. It's not ideal, but we're glad we can do it. And finally, I want to thank Corning for their sponsorship of CBIS this year. With that, I want to turn it over to Sophia Petrula, who will introduce tonight's panelists. Sophia?
Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for tonight's panel, The Cost of Cheap Clothes, the Impact of Fast Fashion on Labor and the Environment. This panel has been organized by Cornell Global Network, a community passionate about engaging with global issues and perspectives through tangible projects, collaborative events, and development opportunities. This panel will focus on sustainability, transparency in supply chains, corporate social responsibility, changing consumer habits, and improving environmental and labor practices. We have an incredible group of panelists from all across the fashion industry involved in everything from mapping global apparel facilities to modern sustainable luxury, to directing environmental initiatives for a worldwide retail company. Our moderator for today is Professor Tasha Lewis, an associate professor in the Department of Fiber Science and Apparel Design, who teaches in the area of fashion design management. Professor Lewis's research interests include the disruptive impact of technology in the apparel industry, global and domestic apparel production issues, and the significance of social responsibility and sustainability through the apparel supply chain. I will now pass it off to Professor Lewis to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm very glad to be here with you today. So today we'll be talking about the cost of cheap clothes, the impacts of fast fashion on labor and the environment. And we have a great panel with us today to talk about this in more detail. We have Agata Smeets, Director of Sustainability Sourcing Strategy at Gap, Natalie Grillen, Executive Director of Open Apparel Registry, and Vanessa Barboni-Halleck, CEO of Another Tomorrow. So I'd like to have each of our panelists say a little bit about their business and what they do in their company and their role. And I'll pass it on to Natalie first, and then you can toss it to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha, and thank you, Sophia, and the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise and all the students for having us. I'm excited to be on this panel with my fellow illustrious panelists, both of whom I get to work with on a daily basis. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. So as Tasha said, I'm the Executive Director of Open Apparel Registry. Open Apparel Registry was launched in 2019, so we're just celebrating our 2nd anniversary. We are a global database of apparel facilities, all under an open data license, which allows stakeholders from across the industry to use our data. We are solving the problem of facility identification, which we can speak more to when we get into the questions. But the biggest thing is if you are trying to make supply chains more sustainable, you have to know where the facilities are, and you have to be able to share data about those facilities across various stakeholders. And Open Apparel Registry enables that through our unique ID for each facility, and then through our global mapping and contributions from across industry. So I will turn it over next to Vanessa.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Natalie. So I'm the CEO and founder of Another Tomorrow. Another Tomorrow is an end-to-end sustainable luxury brand, and we utilize technology to provide full supply chain transparency. So each garment has its own unique digital identity. One can scan a code and see the entirety of the supply chain. And we utilize that same technology to also provide authentication for resale and really bringing in-house a full circular economy business model. And really excited to be here with this group, because I think that transparency and technology are really core to our mission, and certainly a big part of building the infrastructure for the future. And I'm happy with that to pass it over to Agatha.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good evening. My name is Agatha Smeets. I am Director of Global Sustainability at Gap Inc., based out of Hong Kong. Gap, as I hope you know, is one of the biggest U.S. apparel companies. We're a little bit more than 50 years old, have some iconic brands under the Gap Inc. portfolio, such as Old Navy, Banana Republic, Athleta, as well as obviously Gap brand. In my role, which is based out of Hong Kong, I oversee environmental sustainability for our supply chain. So our initiatives around water, climate, transparency, raw materials, and innovation fall on my lap. So very excited to be here to speak on this panel today. And I'll turn it back over to Tasha.
Great, thank you. Thank you for these wonderful introductions. I'm very excited for the conversation that we're about to start. So one of the first questions we want to talk about is really, because we're talking about fast fashion, there are some benefits and some negatives surrounding it. So with many shoppers finding fast fashion to be cheap, accessible, and size inclusive more recently in that feature, how are companies considering incorporating these advantages into a more sustainable production model? So I'll direct that to you, Agatha.
Sure. So right around the time that I joined Gap, now 7 years ago, fast fashion was kind of on everyone's minds. And from the perspective of an apparel company, it was really about how do you make your supply chain more responsive, faster, to get customers the type of styles that they want and need as soon as you can. The advantages of a fast fashion model, the theoretical advantages, is that you are responding to consumer demand, you are producing styles that they want, you are not kind of designing styles 1 or 2 years out and then have them kind of sit on the shelves to be sold. However, what a lot of companies did not see at the time is that there are also disadvantages to fast fashion. It is cheap and accessible, but also because it is cheap and accessible, it is not actually a very sustainable business model. So the last few years have really been dedicated to understanding how we can make fast fashion more sustainable. The size inclusivity is a recent opportunity, as you said. It's something that was really an unaddressed part of the market, and now, for example, Gap, Old Navy, and our other brands are very much now catering to that consumer, and it's really great to see our marketing is changing as well. And we're being able to connect with that consumer a lot more. But in terms of fast fashion, I think the elephant in the room is still kind of overconsumption, right? With a fast fashion model, because you are producing so much, you are having kind of new drops every week or every few weeks. It really is a dance between producing what customers want to buy, but not producing too much. And it's something that the industry is still really learning how to do well and how to make more sustainable. So this is where sustainable raw materials such as recycled polyester, recycled cotton really come in, and the idea of circularity is a really important one. But it's something that's much easier to talk about than to actually implement from the get-go. Circularity takes an entire ecosystem to get right. And right now, I think we are building parts of that ecosystem, but they are not yet as well connected as we are hoping that they will be in the future, to really say that fast fashion is a sustainable business model for apparel.
Thank you very much. Either Natalie or Vanessa, do you want to add on to anything Agatha spoke to here? Great. So we'll move on to the next discussion question. Natalie, I can direct this one to you. It's really talking about corporate social responsibility and what does that look like in 2021 and going forward? how can we differentiate between performative activism and companies that are actively improving their environmental and labor impacts?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. And I apologize if you hear a screaming child in the background. My 18-month-old is taking a bath and she apparently doesn't want to do it. So genuine corporate social responsibility, I think one of the first things that is super important is actual transparency around practices. So I think you see a lot of language, a lot of goals, a lot of fancy reports, some marketing that's done on social media. What you really want to do is dig in and look at a corporation's website or a company's website, look and see how much information they're actually providing you with, and are they speaking authentically and honestly about what it is they've been able to accomplish and what it is that they haven't. Look, as Agata was just saying, it takes a system, it takes an entire ecosystem. A lot of these supply chains are not vertical. Organizations do not control their supply chain, so they have to work collaboratively. And as Agata said so eloquently, I mean, that's why I didn't need to contribute to that last question. She really hit the nail on the head on so many fronts. It requires systemic change. And so if a company is saying, oh, we figured this out, we've got this, it may be because they have a vertical supply chain, but most likely, it might be that they're not really sharing the full picture. I think the other thing I would add is that it's the money. So if you're a giant whale of a company and you are trying to shift towards more sustainable business models, it's going to cost a lot of money to do so. It's going to require investment in your supply chain. It's going to require investment in research and innovation in terms of the materials and fibers you're using. It's going to require some investment in things like just-in-time manufacturing, thinking about how do you really look at entirely different business models from how you've been selling and marketing products. So those are the two quick things that I would say: transparency and their investment in sustainability.
So if I could follow up with that with either you or Agata to talk about how are brands becoming specifically more transparent. Some brands are putting up their supplier list or using your tool. I think, the Higg index is there, but it's more business to business. It's not really consumer facing. Are there tools that enable transparency for the consumer that are available?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually point to Vanessa and Another Tomorrow with one amazing technological feature that they have with the QR codes showing the impact of their product. So she can speak more to that. Gap publishes its supply chain and is looking to publish additional tiers of their supply chain beyond just tier one. So both of our brand representatives on the panel really can speak to what they're doing. I think largely what you're looking for is definitely supply chain disclosure. And in the luxury case, it gets a little bit more complicated, which Vanessa can speak to. But for larger corporations, the whole idea behind publishing a supply chain is so that actors who work in the supply chain and who work on the ground can work collaboratively with you, and really help to understand and in some cases hold accountable to the promises that these organizations have made around what types of things they're doing. I think also increasingly transparency is having, when we speak about sustainability, I obviously focus on, the supply chain side of things, but it's also about visibility into what you're doing in your internal operations. How are you incorporating, diversity, inclusion, racial justice into your practices, and how are you holding yourself accountable? It's one thing to sort of say, oh yeah, we look at hiring, XYZ, but holding yourself accountable to those goals. I've been really impressed with brands like Girlfriend Collective, who are reporting on a regular basis around how they're hitting their targets and where they're falling short. So, by and large, I think supply chain disclosure is super important. It is where a lot of the impact is happening, but there's also internal business operations that consumers are increasingly looking for information on. So I'll turn it over to Vanessa to share more about what Another Tomorrow is doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to. I mean, I think that the first part is clearly knowing your supply chain in the first place. And there are so many layers of opacity within this industry and many, many third parties who get involved in actually putting together these supply chains. At Another Tomorrow, we've had the good fortune of obviously starting from the ground up. And in many cases, that's literally the ground up. So in the case of wool, we're actually buying the raw wool, it's called greasy wool, from the farms, putting it on a boat to Italy, et cetera. And what we've done is we've really amassed this huge relational database that ties the supply chain back to each individual garment. And we work with a partner called Everything, which is kind of the word everything minus a couple of vowels. And they allow us to essentially associate that supply chain with the garment and pull through an API that information that then becomes consumer facing. So I think that technology is just a really critical ingredient, and you have to develop that actual digitized product ecosystem to do that. So Everything is one, Eon is another. There are a number of other really, really interesting new technologies that are focused on very specific supply chains. So, for example, ensuring that the organic cotton that is supposed to be organic cotton at the source and ideally utilizing regenerative farming practices is still that same organic cotton at the end, that there isn't actually, corruption within that system using, in many cases, some really interesting biological markers. So there's just a huge amount of resources and tools, I think, at this point. And it really is just, I think, aligned with what Natalie said. It takes a lot of will and work to put them to best use internally. But overall, I think that this is kind of the enabling architecture for transparency that I find really super, super exciting. I think where we haven't seen as much of it is really on the labor side. I think it's a lot easier to talk about materials right now. And I would just say from sort of an education standpoint, that's something I always like to bring up because I think it's really been the silent and massive issue in terms of how few people are actually paid a living wage. So that's sort of where I would leave off on the transparency front, and happy to kick it over.
Thank you. Any other comments, Agata?
Sure, just a quick one. I think, as Natalie said before, a brand loses a lot of control and a lot of visibility into its supply chain the further upstream you go into the supply chain. And so that's why brands like Another Tomorrow are so amazing, because they really do have control and visibility over their entire process. As you kind of scale up and add volume, like for brands such as Gap, it becomes very hard to keep track of every single actor and node in the supply chain, because there is a lot of fragmentation, there is a lot of subcontracting in the supply chain. So for a typical brand, there is actually a financial relationship between the brand and its tier one suppliers, so the vendors that actually cut fabric and sew it into garments. But then when you actually look at upstream tiers, such as fabric manufacturing, spinning fibers into yarn and growing the fiber or producing the fiber in the case of synthetics, it becomes a lot harder to keep all of the actors kind of, to keep an eye on all of the actors and really understand even how your supply chain is related to them, because there is these several levels of, and a lot of the times those relationships are obfuscated. This is where I think efforts such as the Open Apparel Registry are great. Some of the kind of basic transparency issues that we face is honestly kind of location of the factory, not being able to map them, or people spelling it differently, and kind of losing transparency on very, very basic issues like this. And then also having kind of much better relationships, as Vanessa was saying, much better relationships with your vendors, with mills, and then upstream in the supply chain, and cultivating long-term strategic partnerships with them versus a kind of transactional cost-based relationship, which has been kind of the modus operandi for apparel for a really long time. So We do see that shift happening. It's not going to be an overnight shift, but it's just by the nature of how the supply chain of the industry is configured, it is quite a tough challenge. It's not that, tomorrow, for example, if Gap were to publish its supply chain up to kind of raw materials, we would be able to do so. We are actually constantly doing the homework through tools such as OAR and Hague Index, but it's not that we have everything figured out yet.
Thank you. I've read things about blockchain figuring into transparency. Any of you have comments on that, or are you seeing that come to fruition, or is that something that is real that could help with transparency? I see Natalie smiling. I don't know if that means anything, but
yeah,
we talk about this a lot.
Vanessa knows that I have opinions on this.
Okay.
I think so. So my lead developer, who I at Open Apparel Registry, who's a very, very, very intelligent guy. I think, and he really understands how these software systems are working and how this data is being aggregated and how it's being stored. He compares using blockchain for supply chain transparency and traceability as if you were using a forklift to lift your groceries off of the kitchen floor onto the counter. It's a very powerful tool. It is effective, but really the amount of computing power that you're putting behind this just to achieve immutability of the data isn't really, it's maybe not worth the carbon footprint that you're accumulating. So I'm not an expert on it. I don't know if anybody on this panel is, but I think that what blockchain is really good for is this trade finance and thinking about how do we ensure that really important transactions are being protected. And I'm not saying supply chain data isn't important, but bad data in to the blockchain, bad data out. And that's one of the core problems of supply chain data is what's actually getting entered in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving a perspective on that. Appreciate it. So we'll move on with the next question. And this is looking more at the carbon footprint of fashion. So there are statistics around the impact that fashion has because of the fragmentation in the supply chain when it comes to carbon emissions and global wastewater. Which environmental initiatives have you or your organization focused on? It might be reducing carbon emissions, reducing water, recycling, renewable energy. Can you speak to any specific initiatives that you're undertaking? So Agata or Vanessa, this would apply to you.
Sure. I can kick it off and then Vanessa pass it on. So I remember actually when the 10% number came out, everyone was like, oh, this is way too high. How can this be? This is totally false. And now I think it's become a lot more accepted and backed up in the industry. And we do realize how big of an impact the fashion industry has for greenhouse gas emissions. I would say for us, where we started was really with water. Water, we consider a business critical issue. If there's no water, we cannot do business. And our supply chain, some of the suppliers in our supply chain are in water scarce areas, and that presents a very real risk to us. And so we really kicked off our environmental initiatives looking at, okay, how do we reduce water in operations? In partnership with our suppliers. We are evolving our water strategy to not only look at kind of manufacturing operations, but look at water usage in raw material production, such as cotton growing, which actually has a much higher water footprint than manufacturing. We've added a focus on carbon emissions because of the Paris Agreement, because of kind of the immense focus on carbon emissions, globally, not just in the apparel industry. And so very early last year, in January 2020, we did publish a science-based target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We have had targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I believe, throughout the last decade, but some of those early targets focused on our owned and operated operations, so our headquarters, our stores, our distribution centers, and and we've actually made great strides in purchasing renewable energy to offset these emissions, or not offset, but to account for these emissions. But last year, when we published our science-based target, was the first time that we included a target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from our supply chain, which when we took a look at the data, and the data is actually not easy to come by to understand what are your greenhouse gas emissions are. And so that's where the Higg index actually comes in very handy, taken with a big grain of salt. But to actually understand, okay, the vast majority of our greenhouse gas impact is in our supply chain, in manufacturing our product. So how do we work, again, collaboratively with our suppliers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And so that's anything from increasing the operational efficiency of our supply chain operations through partnerships with, for example, Apparel Impact Institute, which runs several programs in different geographies focused on efficiency, to really looking at how do you purchase renewable energy, or how do you facilitate your suppliers to purchase renewable energy. And so you're getting into kind of maturity of and instruments available in the supply chain for renewable energy purchases for your suppliers, which is maturing super fast. It's not yet, an off the shelf, like if I wanted to offset or purchase renewable energy for all of my emissions in India, for example, that's available. So it's very much, we are working at the front lines with our suppliers to understand how do we meet our targets and go beyond our targets. But I would say water and carbon. The third one is really around waste, and this is where the circularity theme comes in again. How do we eliminate single-use plastics in our packaging? How do we recycle more? How do we incorporate regenerative materials in our products? But I'll pass it over to Vanessa for her perspective.
Okay, thank you.
It's amazing to hear everything that you're doing, because it clearly requires the kitchen, the kitchen sink. It's incredible. Yeah. So we're very much on the opposite side of the spectrum, just insofar as we are, a brand new and certainly more nimble company. And I would say that our approach has been certainly to minimize our footprint as much as we possibly can, while also seeking to model what we kind of consider best in class and demonstrate its feasibility. And so I would say the kind of impact areas that we're focused on the environmental side are, certainly emissions. We do have a footprint, and we offset that footprint at 120%. Biodiversity, increasingly, and also chemicals, a little bit less so water, but the various ways that we approach this are, first and foremost, the best way to reduce impact is just to keep the garments in use for as long as you possibly can. So super high quality garments that, by and large are meant to last a lifetime, and then embedding circular business models into our business. So in our case, through owned resale, and we also have this size exchange program that means that if your body changes, you can swap out a size. You don't have multiple items sitting in your closet that are different sizes, but really seeking to create, through product quality and business model, the longest life cycle possible for the products that we make. Beyond that, it really is a significant focus on the raw materials level. That is where the vast majority of the impact happens, particularly for biodiversity. So we only source organic raw materials, so organic cotton, organic linen. When it comes to wool, we just sourced from 2 farms that embed both regenerative agricultural practices in addition to the animal welfare standards. And another big one that I think that tends to be underplayed in the industry is viscose. So in our case, we use FSC certified viscose that's predominantly coming from a supply chain in Sweden. And it's a pretty material issue in terms of the use of virgin fibers in the viscose supply chain. In terms of where we think that we can still do a lot better, it's really increasing our recycled fiber content. And in that, we are quite focused on doing so in cellulosic fiber. So we're currently working on a new fabric that would replace our virgin our tencel with a regenerated cellulose fiber. And, really beyond that, we're continuing to really look at activism and where we can play a role in policy change as being something that's very core to the brand, because we know that there are so many things that can only happen either through collaboration or through actual policy change. And so if you look at 2 of the petitions we have up on our website, they're good examples of that. So one really focuses actually on one specific pesticide called chlorpyrifos that's used globally, happens to be used on cotton, but on other agricultural products as well. It's a neurotoxin. And then another that's focused on a very specific issue around the deforestation of old growth forests in British Columbia. So, it was sort of a kitchen sink approach also in a very different way. But we're really trying to lead and demonstrate what's possible.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's an issue around scale and scalability and a critical mass in doing a lot of these initiatives. So it's great to hear what you're doing. We're going to shift to the chat a little bit because they're starting to get questions from our audience. So these are questions I can suggest who can answer, but you can jump in. So one of the first questions we have is there's criticism from many about consumers' fashion and general merchandise decisions. One of the criticisms is that organic sustainable garments are out of their price range and they don't want to wait years for economies of scale to drive those prices down. What ways do you suggest to ameliorate this issue? Anyone?
So I can start, but guys, jump in. So again, creating enough supply of organic cotton is huge. So for example, if Gap Inc., all of our Gap Inc. brands were to go to 100% organic tomorrow, there wouldn't be enough organic cotton in the world to actually be able to do that. And so I think there are organizations such as OCA or OCA, the Organic Cotton Accelerator. There are Textile exchanges very heavily involved here who are really working on increasing supply of organic cotton in the world so that it is more accessible for brands. Right now, organic is a premium fiber for us, and so there is a very real cost impact, which, as a brand, especially as a large brand, we are trying to mitigate as much as we can and offer organic to our customers at a attainable price. And so, for example, for Gap brand, if you go, our tees, or everyday kind of favorite tees right now have shifted to organic cotton for our Gap brand. And so we are very committed to increasing organic cotton availability in our assortment. And if you look at the pricing, we're not kind of passing that cost on to the customer. However, there are kind of very real market dynamics going on. Everyone, it seems, is trying to get into organic cotton, which is creating kind of supply constraints, which is creating pricing constraints. And so it's as a consumer signaling that desire, that demand to the brands to kind of keep on going after premium fibers such as organic, to be able to really increase supply so that it is kind of an available cotton. But growing organic, harvesting organic cotton is a very different business than harvesting conventional cotton. And there are very real higher costs in the supply chain for doing so. So I would say part of the mindset shift is also, I think, going to be around, well, as a consumer, how much am I willing to pay for an organic t-shirt or just for my clothes in general? I think over the last several decades, the price of clothing, normalized over time has really fallen. And so as consumers, and I include myself in that, even working for an apparel company, you don't expect clothes to be kind of a big investment out of your wallet. And so you have, as a consumer, you have to also look at your purchasing behavior and say, well, is that actually right? Because as brands, we take a lot of stock over what our consumers are demanding and asking of us. And so if they're going for lower price, that's what a lot of brands are geared up to. Versus if we hear, no, we want organic, we want sustainable, we want everything, and we're willing to kind of purchase, then that definitely turns the mindset of the company and sets them on that path.
Thank you. So I have another question in the chat. Did anyone want to respond to this one before we move on to the next chat question?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly share, I think it's a super interesting question specifically focused on organic cotton. And the only reason I chime in is because my introduction to fashion supply chains was actually working with organic cotton farmers in Uganda. And the thing I would encourage consumers to do, and it's the question at Fashion Revolution, which is a great organization to follow if you're interested in learning more about the impact of fashion. It's the question that they pose every year, and it's actually coming up pretty soon on the anniversary of Rana Plaza. Who made my clothes? And I think when you look at an item of clothing, you really need to think this didn't just come out of a machine. There are people all along the supply chain who have worked to bring this item to you. And the more you pay for that item, the hopefully in most cases, right? The more that person down the supply chain has been able to been paid for their work. And organic cotton, as Agata said, it's a premium fabric because it requires more work to actually bring it to market. One of the most incredible stories, there's a farmer in Uganda who we worked closely with, who had previously lived in a mud hut, and because he sold organic cotton, he was actually able to put a tin roof over his house. So this is having a real impact on people's lives in the supply chain, the fact that you're paying a little bit more, you're improving the quality of life, you're preventing slave labor. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it's a shift in mindset, but I really encourage people to think about the people who are working in the supply chains of all the products you buy, not just fashion.
Thank you. So I think it's also the visibility, because I see a high price. I don't necessarily know how the margins break down and who got paid what. So we get into some issues around fair trade and things like that that also should be addressed. So that kind of dovetails into the next question that we have from the audience is, what should we be looking for to make sure we don't fall for brands that are greenwashing versus actually having sustainable practices? So what can they do to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing?
Yeah, I guess I'm happy to take that one. I really think it's in the details. And so looking at really the details, I would say particularly around labor, that's, I think, really a dividing factor in terms of who's quite focused and who isn't. I think right now it's really easy to talk about materials. And so I like to look for what brands are saying in terms of the labor in their supply chains and being really transparent about ideally what wages they're actually paying. And if not, then at least what they're doing about the issue specifically. And then certainly around what their actual policies are. So I think oftentimes it's very easy to bring a specific product to market that looks really great and has a very strong story behind it. It's more difficult to shift, an entire supply chain. So definitely look for policies that are more holistic and institutionalized across an entire business, even if that means that things aren't perfect today. So, you'd rather support that today and be a part of change as long as it's like clear seriousness of purpose there. I would also highlight B Corp as an institutional structure. It's definitely no joke to go through. And I think it just demonstrates a seriousness of intent and purpose and a true legal framework for a stakeholder model. So those are a few of the things that I definitely would advocate on my end.
Great. So there's a question kind of relating to that, where they want to know what areas should consumers be looking for as the most impactful when making a decision. Some companies don't report on everything, so should they be looking for the information on water use, or if they're using recycled materials? Do you think there's a particular aspect of sustainability that consumers should be really aware of when they're making decisions?
Well, some of this comes down to what you care about as a consumer. I think sustainability is a dynamic, shifting system. It is not a goal to be attained. And so companies and organizations are constantly working to move the needle across a variety of different goals and impact. I mean, just from what Vanessa and Agata were sharing on what they're doing in terms of environmental footprint, there are additional things and topics that fall under the environmental, section of goals that they didn't even mention. So part of it can be, what do you as a consumer really care about? But I think that from my perspective, some of the most pressing issues in terms of the fashion industry's footprint are definitely carbon footprint, I think waste, and carbon footprint touches a lot of things, including waste, actually, like the accumulation of those products and the amount of carbon that's used to create them, and then just being thrown away. But then also from my perspective, specifically with Open Apparel Registry, transparency is super important because none of these organizations can solve all of these problems alone. So we have to collaborate. And the way to do that is one of the key ways is in sharing data so that we understand, take carbon footprint, for example. What is our footprint? What is your footprint? Where do we overlap in facilities? Where can we actually move the needle together? It all starts with data. So I do truly think that transparency and sharing your data and being open with your impact is a very important thing.
Thank you.
I would just add super quickly that it's, depending on what you care about, as Natalie said, right, it is a very dynamic space. It's a very big space. Ask the brand, get in touch through the customer service kind of rep and ask the question. We actually treat these questions very seriously. We have questions going to the Global Sustainability Department that came in through either the phone or chat or email from customers, and see how a brand answers, and whether they have a answer, whether kind of, it is a little bit of a template answer that doesn't really tell you more details. I think, in marketing and in talking about the efforts that they're doing, there's always kind of a fine line. You don't want to give too many details because it might be boring to a lot of customers, but there are some customers that really do care about the details. And I think brands are happy to give more information if it's being asked for. They just, in marketing, they walk a fine line between making it understandable and accessible. And, a lot of people don't care about how much water was saved in a given facility, or how, the product was treated, or what chemicals are going into it. So we're still kind of figuring out how to talk about sustainability in a way that is authentic, that gives detail, but that doesn't kind of overwhelm the customer. And, we are very aware that customers are very educated or becoming very educated about these topics. And, we always are very happy when people care, and we want more people to care, speaking from a global sustainability department perspective. But you're not always going to see that on the marketing because it's not really sexy in a way. But if there is detail behind it, brands should be happy to give you that detail. And if they don't, that's kind of how you know that, maybe it's just marketing. It's not actually, there's not kind of meat behind there.
Great. Thank you. So we'll shift a little bit. There are two kind of country level questions. So someone just asked the question, what happened to the Bangladesh Accord, or what's happening with it? And then there was another question about emerging countries and how they're impacted by the incorrect or unfair practices in the industry. And it seems that sustainable business models could capitalize and generate some traction in these countries, but it's quite difficult. So they want to know, what can they do in these countries, particularly in Latin America, to offer some type of value? What's the value proposition for emerging countries to really try to take on some of these business models? I know I combined two of them, but does anyone want to tackle my compound question there for solutions?
So the Bangladesh Accord is still around, but my most recent understanding is that they are up for a very important decision, Agata, to be renewed. Maybe.
I am not the person. Unfortunately, this is kind of what happens when you have a big company with roles and responsibilities. They are still around. I think they are focused on fire and building safety. There is kind of an outgrowth from the Accord. I don't know what that big decision that they're up against is. Apologize.
They're up for renewal. They actually contribute data to Open Apparel Registry, eligible factories and ineligible factories. So if you go to openapparel.org, you can look at our contributors and you'll see two different lists. So they are implementing and they're working on the ground, but their mission is threatened, I think, because of ongoing, investment in their work. Okay. Emerging markets, I am not the person to answer that question, but maybe Vanessa is.
I can take that partially. I say this carefully because we actually we manufacture in Europe and in Los Angeles, so I don't want to speak out of turn. My former life was in emerging markets finance. And I was actually looking a bit at sort of where things stand in Bangladesh, and specifically because I think that in many cases people have talked about these very, very low paying jobs as kind of a stepping stone to greater sophistication within economies. And I think unfortunately that has been true in more limited circumstances than people might hope. I mean, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, you're still in a situation where 80% of exports are garment exports. So there really hasn't been a tremendous amount of diversification. And unfortunately, I was just looking at the statistics for the end of last year. If you look like for like, manufacturers were requesting that people, that they paid 12% less for exactly the same product year over year. So that's a pretty disturbing trend. In terms of what changes that, I think that given where we are in the world, technology transfer is going to be really critical if these countries are going to be a part of the next wave of modernization. I think there's a tremendous pull toward localization that is a concern. And so I think technology transfer is really, really important. But ultimately, we need a system that can support higher wages. I think that that's just going to have to be a part of it. And I do think if we think about also clothing as an asset, finding financing mechanisms that can also help people access higher quality product is also going to be a part of the solution.
Great, thank you. Another chat question, this gets at consumption. So it says overconsumption starts with overproduction. So are we making a lot and people are buying a lot? So they want to know, why isn't on-demand happening more broadly? So on-demand manufacturing, why aren't we doing that more broadly in the industry as opposed to mass production?
Maybe I can take that from a high volume apparel, and Vanessa would love to hear kind of from a smaller brand perspective. Mm-hmm. It's hard to do. It's really hard to do. The current supply chains that have existed aren't really set up to do on-demand manufacturing. When you look at a supply chain, right, fabric, yarn and fabric can be produced in one country. That fabric shipped to another country for assembly, so cut-sew, and then that is all shipped to the U.S. to go into a store or into a distribution center waiting for an online order. The time to actually ship a finished garment from, for example, Vietnam to California is around kind of 6 weeks. And so when you think about on demand, that's a really long time, right? You can air that product in, but then you're trading off higher carbon footprint and kind of less efficient mode of transport, which for high volumes of product really adds up. So there are shifts in the supply chain. There are now, there's kind of a denim laundry that opened up in LA recently, and so you can kind of have raw fabric or beige fabric shipped to LA, waiting for an order and being finished in that laundry. So there are kind of changes in the supply chain that kind of move it closer to the final customer. But if you look at an apparel supply chain, it really is a very global entity, and it was set up, the original model was set up kind of years ago, back when, there was a weird quota system in the apparel world. And it was really to kind of reduce costs and find efficiencies. And so that trade-off happened where it was easier to ship, different components of a garment from country to country versus produce it all close to the customer. Again, I think it's going to take a few years to kind of see more of that shift, but it is happening. It's probably not going to be for all apparel. It does kind of add a price component, but it is a very exciting space to watch. So I would say it's coming. It's probably not going to be the end all be all, but ideally, right, as a customer, there's also kind of a consumption pattern shift where, we live in the era of Amazon where you click on something, you buy it, and then 2 hours later you have it at your front door, except if you live in Hong Kong. But that expectation maybe is not the right one when you're buying kind of apparel. So Vanessa, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to touch on this. It was funny, when I first came into this industry, I was just shocked. I think it's one of the most speculative industries I've ever seen. It's so inherently so. And so, that would make you want to be as demand responsive as you possibly can be. And I think what I got to just articulate is that it's very hard the way supply chains are currently set up. And so this is something that we've been talking a lot about internally. And we found that, for certain products, just in time doesn't make a lot of sense, because you can actually already be quite demand responsive. And that's things like, t-shirts and knitwear that are, fairly quick turn to market. There are other products that, similarly would be exceptionally difficult to actually do just in time, like a tailored jacket that takes many components. It's, done, by hand, it's real craft, and would not be done on a timeline, let's say, that people would find palatable in aggregate. But there are a bunch of other products that I think are really quite interesting. And so for us, because we are now at the point where we're kind of platforming fabrics, i.e., we use a core set of fabrics and we're consistently buying into them, that does set you up for a model where you can actually start to localize production and make it more just in time, which I do think in aggregate will be quite helpful. But this shift in consumer behaviors and attitudes is going to have to come alongside some of the other technology, so we can kind of meet in the middle. Otherwise, the technology can move, here, but if the customer expectations are still here, it won't be as impactful as we might like. So I think that there are going to be some exciting things and some real investments in manufacturing, especially in this country, that are pretty exciting.
Thank you. So I think we have one more that we can answer, and this is really interesting for me because it deals with post-consumer textile waste. So this idea of circularity, the idea that we emit energy, we use up energy when we're making garments, but what about at the end of life? What can we do to minimize the impact of waste? And also with the large amount of returns that come out of e-commerce shopping and sizing issues and things that are sent back, how do we begin to deal with the waste question in fashion?
Yeah, I can start and guys jump in. I think the consumer part of the value chain is one. First of all, I think the impact is very hard the impact of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, is hard to calculate with any sort of precision. I think, as Vanessa said earlier on, the best thing that you as a customer can do is try to extend the life of your garments by treating it nicely, washing it not as often as you typically do, probably, washing it in cold water, line drying it, which sounds like, you're not using as much technology to take care of our clothes, but it's actually much better for the fiber. Every time a garment is run through a dryer, the fiber disintegrates a little bit. The spandex loses a little bit of its elasticity, so you're actually reducing the life of your garment that way. In terms of actually waste, that is a huge issue, and so again, you need an ecosystem to kind of take care of it all. Not what one brand or one company by itself is not going to be able to do it all. We have gotten into, and what's exciting now for I think a lot of retailers are new business models such as rentals, such as resale. So for example, Gap recently signed a partnership, or not so recently, but signed a partnership with ThreadUp to be able to resell kind of gently worn and used garments to give them a second life. So I think those types of business models are really exciting opportunities. And there's kind of the rise of websites such as RealReal or Vestiaire Collective that are really capitalizing on that, especially in the luxury segment. But in terms of kind of really looking at post-consumer textiles recycling, first you need a good way to actually collect the garments in a way that allows them to be properly sorted, allows you to actually identify what they're made out of, to be sorted, allows you to actually remove trims, right? So I'm wearing a denim jacket. There are a lot of buttons. There's a lot of labels, threads. So actually removing those components is a huge part of being able to come to a circular solution. So manufacturing the garment with kind of disassembly in mind is going to be a huge part of it. And then actually, taking the sorted garments and being able to recycle them. So mechanical recycling technology is actually pretty mature. It's pretty good, but fundamentally it does basically reduce the length of, if we're talking about a cotton garment, reduce the length of the cotton staple that you have. So, a cotton staple is typically about, 20, 25 centimeters, about 19, 20 millimeters long. If you're chopping it up and make mechanical recycling, you're making it shorter. And so by definition, you're making it lower quality, right? So how do you not lose the quality when you are recycling garments? There are chemical recycling techniques that are coming online as well, but they're still pretty nascent. And then how do you actually find the supply chains that can reuse that sort of fiber? So there's a lot of questions and problems rolled into this bigger question of waste. And again, different actors need to come with solutions, but ultimately we need to create kind of a system that will go beyond kind of the private sector. It will have to involve, municipal collecting efforts. It will have to involve governments to be able to incentivize the collection and the sorting and the recycling, and then incentivize actually the reuse of those fibers and garments.
I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this has been wonderful. I can't believe it's almost 7 o'clock, so I could talk to you guys all day. So I just want to thank you very much for all of your contributions and perspectives. And I want to bring Mark back in as we wrap up. But thank you all again. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tasha.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. That was fantastic. Thanks to everybody who participated on the panel, Agata, Natalie, Vanessa, and Tasha also for moderating. The discussion questions were great. I love the range of issues that you raised in this industry. I know there was a lot of interest in the panel, and people will not leave tonight disappointed, so thank you. To the audience, thank you for getting engaged and asking the questions and making Tasha's job that much easier. I know she appreciated it. And I wanted to just say, I hope you will join us for our next CBIS session, which is scheduled for tomorrow, April 9th, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, when we'll be discussing achieving equity, the power of community organizing and small business revitalization. Until then, have a good day.